The sign at the edge of the world doesn't say danger or no trespassing. It doesn't have to. Enforcement is handled by the continent itself. Temperatures dropping to minus 128 degrees Fahrenheit. Winds reaching 200 miles per hour. Ice sheets 2 miles thick in some places, pressing down on bedrock with the weight of geological time. But here's what the documentaries about penguins and polar expeditions never tell you. Antarctica is the most valuable piece of real estate on this planet, not metaphorically, not in some distant future. Right now, today, the ice covering it sits on top of an estimated 200 billion barrels of oil, more proven reserves than Saudi Arabia and Russia combined. The Transantarctic Mountains contain one of the largest untouched coal deposits in human history. Beneath the bedrock lie rare earth elements, the exact minerals that make your phone, your electric car, your wind turbines, your entire modern life possible, in concentrations that would make every current mining operation on Earth look like someone digging with a garden spade. And then, in 1959, 12 of the world's most powerful nations sat down in Washington, D.C., signed a piece of paper, and agreed that no one gets to touch any of it. They called it a treaty for peace and science. What it actually was is the most consequential act of resource lockdown in the history of human civilization. This is the story of Antarctica, not the one about penguins. The one about power, money, and the $500 trillion question that no one in a position of authority wants you to spend too much time thinking about. To understand why Antarctica is what it is today, you need to understand the version of the story we've all been told. The clean version taught in schools and repeated in nature documentaries whenever a signatory nation needs to sound enlightened. Antarctica was discovered relatively late in human history. The Russian explorer Fabian Gottlieb von Bellingshausen spotted the continental ice shelf in 1820. The British naval officer Edward Bransfield is credited by some historians with sighting the Antarctic Peninsula around the same time. The American sealer Nathaniel Palmer was also in the area. No one can agree on who technically got there first, which is fitting, because Antarctica's entire modern history is a story about competing claims that keep getting papered over with the language of cooperation. For most of the 19th century, Antarctica was the domain of sealers and whalers who cared about the waters around it, teeming with fur seals and southern right whales. Within decades, they hunted both species to the edge of extinction, fitting in its own way. Because the exploitation of Antarctica's surrounding resources began well before anyone signed any treaty about protecting them, then came the heroic era, Scott, Amundsen, Shackleton. Between 1895 and 1922, expedition after expedition pushed into the interior, racing toward the South Pole, planting flags, dying spectacularly, and capturing the imagination of a public raised on the idea that the planet's blank spaces were there to be filled in by brave men from the right countries. Roald Amundsen reached the South Pole on December 14, 1911. Scott arrived 33 days later and died on the return journey. Shackleton never reached the pole, but kept his entire crew alive after his ship was crushed by pack ice. By the early 20th century, Argentina, Chile, the United Kingdom, Norway, Australia, France, and New Zealand had made overlapping territorial claims. 3 nations claimed the same land simultaneously on the Antarctic Peninsula. Then came the International Geophysical Year of 1957-1958, a coordinated scientific program involving 67 countries. 12 of those nations had established Antarctic research stations. At the end of it, those same 12 sat down and negotiated the Antarctic Treaty, signed in Washington on December 1, 1959. The treaty designates Antarctica as a continent for peace and science. It prohibits military activity and nuclear testing. It sets aside the question of territorial sovereignty. It guarantees freedom of scientific research. In the official story, this is presented as one of humanity's great diplomatic achievements. Cold War rivals the United States and the Soviet Union agreeing to preserve an entire continent. Peaceful scientific cooperation, that is the story. Now, here is what the story leaves out. Before the diplomats sat down to negotiate that treaty, the geologists had already done their homework. The connection between Antarctic geology and the resource potential beneath the ice didn't begin with satellite imaging and modern seismic surveys. It began with something any student of plate tectonics already knows. Antarctica was once part of Gondwana. Gondwana included South America, Africa, Australia, India, and Antarctica, before continental drift pulled them apart. The same geological formations that produce the mineral wealth of southern Africa extend into Antarctica. The same formations that generated oil and gas in the southern Atlantic basin continue under the ice. This was not a secret in 1959. Early expeditions had already revealed coal seams in the transantarctic mountains. Coal doesn't form in polar conditions. It forms in warm tropical environments, meaning Antarctica once sat at a warmer latitude. That same geological complexity signals the potential for other valuable deposits. By the 1940s and 1950s, seismic surveys had begun to reveal significant oil and gas indicators beneath the Antarctic continental shelf. The U.S. Geological Survey estimated in 1990 that the shelf could contain as much as 200 billion barrels of oil. Other estimates range from 36 billion to 500 billion barrels. For context, Saudi Arabia's proven reserves are around 267 billion barrels. The entire Middle East holds around 800 billion barrels of proven reserves, developed over decades of intensive drilling. Antarctica has never been drilled for oil, not once. Those estimates are based on geological inference, not wells. No one knows the real number, but what the geologists in 1959 knew, and what the diplomats knew the geologists knew, is that the number was very large. Large enough that whoever controlled Antarctic resource rights in the future would control something of extraordinary economic and geopolitical significance. That is the context in which the Antarctic Treaty must be understood, not as a spontaneous expression of scientific idealism, but as a preemptive act of resource governance by the nation's position. To make it, look at the 12 original signatories and ask a simple question: who are these people? The United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, France, Australia, New Zealand, Norway, Argentina, Chile, Belgium, South Africa, Japan. What do they have in common? They are, without exception, either wealthy industrialized nations that already dominated the global economy in 1959, or nations with direct strategic and territorial interests in the Antarctic region. Not one is from the developing world in any meaningful sense. Not one is from South or Southeast Asia beyond Japan. Not one is from the Middle East or Central Africa. Every one of them had the existing technological capacity, naval capability, economic infrastructure, and political standing to eventually exploit Antarctic resources. This is not coincidence. This is selection. By 1959, decolonization was accelerating. India had gained independence in 1947. Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African nation in 1957. The UN was debating the doctrine of permanent sovereignty over natural resources, asserting every nation's right to control and benefit from resources within its territory. The Antarctic Treaty was signed in December 1959. The UN Declaration on Permanent Sovereignty over Natural Resources was adopted in December 1962, 3 years apart. The 12 nations most positioned to benefit from Antarctic resources signed a governance treaty locking those resources under their shared management in 1959. 3 years later, the international community established the legal principle that would have made that arrangement far more difficult to construct. The treaty was signed in the window between the acceleration of decolonization and the formal establishment of the legal framework that would have complicated its architecture significantly. They acted while they could before the rules changed. Once operating, the treaty became self-reinforcing. Nations inside had scientific data, infrastructure, legal precedent, and diplomatic relationships that outsiders lacked. The cost of meaningful entry rose with every year. The original Antarctic Treaty was deliberately vague about resources. Explicit prohibition would be hard to maintain indefinitely. Explicit permission would cause immediate problems. So the architects said nothing specific and left the issue for later. Later arrived in the late 1980s when the treaty parties negotiated CRAMRA, the Convention on the Regulation of Antarctic Mineral Resource Activities, a framework for eventually extracting Antarctic minerals in a regulated, supervised way. It was never ratified. Australia and France withdrew their support in 1989, citing environmental concerns triggered by the Exxon Valdez oil spill, which had created enormous public backlash against offshore petroleum development. CRAMRA collapsed. In its place, the parties negotiated the Protocol on Environmental Protection to the Antarctic Treaty, signed in Madrid in 1991 and enforced from 1998. The Madrid Protocol prohibits all commercial mineral resource activity in Antarctica, including oil and gas extraction, for 50 years from its entry into force. 50 years from 1998 is 2048. The protocol can be reviewed after that date. If any consultative party requests a conference, the prohibition can be lifted if 3/4 of the consultative parties agree. There is no automatic extension, no presumption of permanence. The Madrid Protocol is a moratorium, not a ban. It is a 50-year pause with a defined review mechanism. This is the central economic fact about Antarctica that almost never makes it into public discourse. The world's largest untapped resource reserve is under a moratorium that expires within the career horizon of people currently entering professional life. Every research station built, every geological survey conducted, every legal standing maintained is an investment in position for when 2048 arrives and the conversation changes. The honest answer is that the complete picture remains unknown. The ice sheet averages 7,000 feet thick. In places it reaches 15,000 feet. It covers 98% of the continent. What lies beneath has been mapped primarily through satellite gravity measurements, airborne radar, and seismic profiling, rather than direct geological sampling. The picture is still incomplete, but what it shows is extraordinary. The Gambutsev Mountains are a range comparable to the Alps, sitting entirely beneath the East Antarctic ice sheet, completely submerged under miles of ice. First detected by Soviet scientists in 1958 through seismic measurements, never seen directly, their mineral composition inferred from geophysical data, and their relationship to the geological provinces of southern Africa and Australia, both of which contain significant gold, iron ore, nickel, and platinum group element deposits. The Transantarctic Mountains, 200 miles long, divide the continent into East and West Antarctica. The portions protruding above the ice contain coal deposits studied since the early expeditions. They also expose basement rock. revealing geological structures associated with mineral wealth in the connected continental fragments that are now South Africa and Australia. Beneath the West Antarctic ice sheet lie sedimentary basins of the type that generate oil and gas: the Weddell Sea Basin, the Ross Sea Basin, and the Wilkes Basin in East Antarctica. All three have characteristics consistent with productive petroleum systems. The Antarctic continental shelf, assessed through geophysical surveys, has been estimated to potentially contain reserves ranking among the world's largest offshore oil provinces. Then there are rare earth elements. China produces between 60 and 85% of the global supply, essential for electric vehicle motors, wind turbines, and precision weapons. Rare earth deposits have been identified in Antarctic rock exposures, and the geological connection to southern Africa and Australia strongly suggests larger concentrations beneath the ice. No one is permitted to survey for them. And then there is freshwater, which may be the most consequential resource of all. If you want to understand who is taking the 2048 question seriously in practical, measurable terms, look at what China has been doing in Antarctica for the past 2 decades. China became a consultative party to the Antarctic Treaty in 1985. Since then, it has built 5 permanent research stations on the continent. The most recent Kinling station was completed in 2024, giving China a year-round presence in East Antarctica it previously lacked. China now has more Antarctic research stations than any European nation. It has also commissioned 2 dedicated icebreaking research vessels, the Zhulong and Zhulong II, expanding its operational capacity in Southern Ocean waters significantly. Chinese scientific teams have conducted extensive geological and geophysical surveys across Antarctica, particularly in East Antarctica, where the oldest and geologically richest portions of the continent lie. They have mapped subglacial lake systems, conducted seismic profiling of sedimentary basins, and gathered rock samples at a pace that exceeds any obvious requirement for the climate and atmospheric research that dominates public descriptions of their program. Chinese officials have been notably direct about Antarctic resource economics in venues Western press rarely covers. A 2012 statement by a senior polar scientist that China needed a fair share of Antarctic resources circulated without generating diplomatic attention. Russia maintains more research stations in Antarctica than any other nation. Russian researchers discovered Lake Vostok, the largest subglacial lake on the continent, sitting beneath nearly 2.5 miles of ice and isolated for 15 to 34 million years. Scientists penetrated it in 2012. The full results have not been comprehensively published. The pattern across all major powers is the same: sustained physical presence, extensive data collection, careful maintenance of legal standing, and a long-term orientation that is only explicable if you take seriously what becomes revisable in 2048. No one builds 5 permanent research stations on a frozen continent purely out of a passion for meteorology. In 1983, Malaysia raised the question of Antarctica at the United Nations General Assembly. The argument was simple and, from a certain perspective, unanswerable. Antarctica belongs to all of humanity. Its resources should benefit all of humanity. The governance structure of the Antarctic Treaty, controlled by a self-selected club that arrogated to itself the authority to make decisions about a continent no one owns, is a form of resource colonialism dressed in the language of science and environmental responsibility. The Malaysian position attracted support from developing nations across Asia, Africa, and Latin America in debates labeled the question of Antarctica. Through the 1980s, the treaty parties led by the United States and United Kingdom, resisted any expansion of UN authority, arguing that including nations without Antarctic presence would undermine the framework. The environmental turn culminating in the Madrid Protocol of 1991 effectively diffused the Malaysian challenge. It was much harder to make the resource colonialism argument against a governance system that had just committed to prohibiting resource extraction entirely. The treaty parties preempted the resource sovereignty argument by declaring they wouldn't exploit the resources at all, which is different from saying the developing world should share in whatever. Exploitation eventually happens. Antarctica's governance still remains controlled by the consultative party structure. There are now 29 consultative parties with actual decision-making authority. The list is still dominated by wealthy industrialized nations and their geopolitical partners. Sub-Saharan Africa, with the exception of South Africa, has essentially no decision-making voice. Southeast Asia, South Asia, and the Middle East have minimal representation relative to their share of global population. Treaty parties without consultative standing, without a seat at the table, have no meaningful mechanism to shape the outcome. The Malaysian argument was never answered. It was only outmaneuvered. The transformation of Antarctica into an icon of environmental purity has been one of the most effective rhetorical moves in the history of resource politics. The environmental movement found in Antarctica something close to a perfect symbol, a continent pristine, remote, untouched by industrial civilization, inhabited only by penguins and the scientists who study them. The campaign for the Madrid Protocol drew enormous public energy from environmentalist organizations. The environmental concerns are real and serious. An oil spill in Southern Ocean conditions would be catastrophic and essentially unremediable by any current technology. But it is worth noticing precisely who benefits most from the environmental shield beyond the environment itself. Nations with established access and accumulated data benefit from a prohibition that prevents new entrants. The ban is universal in legal form, but deeply asymmetric in effect. The nations building bases and mapping geology for decades will be in fundamentally stronger positions when the moratorium becomes revisable. The environmental protection framework functions structurally as a competitive moat. The nations that got their first benefit from a prohibition that freezes the competitive landscape, while they continue improving their position relative to everyone else. Whatever the genuine merits of Antarctic environmental protection, and those merits are real, the governance structure it reinforces is one that concentrates future resource rights in the hands of nations that were positioned in 1959. The oil and mineral story is the dramatic one, but there is a strong argument that the most strategically important resource stored in and on Antarctica is the least glamorous one, water. The fresh water stored in Antarctic ice represents approximately 61% of all fresh surface water on Earth. The East Antarctic ice sheet alone contains roughly 5 million cubic kilometers of fresh water. The global freshwater crisis is structural, not cyclical. Aquifers that took millions of years to accumulate are being drawn down in decades. The Ogallala Aquifer beneath the American Great Plains is being depleted at rates that will exhaust meaningful portions within the lifetimes of people alive today. Aquifers beneath the North China Plain, the North Indian Plain, and the agricultural heartlands of Pakistan face similar trajectories. Climate change compounds the problem by disrupting the glacial melt cycles that recharge surface freshwater systems across the Himalayas, the Andes, and Central Asia. Antarctica holds 61% of the world's surface freshwater. It is not being depleted. The East Antarctic ice sheet has been stable or gaining surface mass in some assessments, even as West Antarctic glaciers lose volume. It is, in practical terms, an effectively permanent freshwater reserve of almost incalculable scale. The idea of harvesting Antarctic freshwater has been studied since 1977, when Saudi Arabia funded a RAND study on towing icebergs to the Arabian Peninsula, which concluded the physics were workable. A French entrepreneur's iceberg towing proposal attracted serious attention during Cape Town's 2018 water crisis. The engineering challenges are real, but not categorically different from other large maritime operations. The legal barrier is absolute under the Madrid Protocol until 2048. The regions facing the most severe water stress in coming decades have no seat at the governance table. The freshwater question may ultimately force a renegotiation on genuinely inclusive terms, because the populations facing water stress are too large and too politically significant to accept indefinitely an arrangement in which 61% of the world's surface freshwater is managed by a club they had no role in forming. Let's be precise about what development of Antarctica's resources would actually mean. If the petroleum reserves are in the range of higher estimates 150 to 200 billion barrels of economically recoverable oil, their development would represent the largest single addition to proven global energy supply since the opening of Middle Eastern fields in the mid-20th century. The nations of OPEC, whose geopolitical leverage rests substantially on concentrated petroleum reserves, would face a competitive alternative that cannot be restricted by a cartel arrangement. Russia, whose economy depends significantly on petroleum revenues, would face similar structural pressure. The nations with Antarctic extraction rights under the treaty framework would gain a form of energy independence currently possessed by only a handful of countries. If Antarctica's rare earth deposits are comparable in scale to those inferred from the geological relationships with southern Africa and Australia, their development could permanently break China's structural dominance of rare earth supply. The strategic importance of rare earth elements to the clean energy transition has elevated supply security to a first-order national security concern for the United States, the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and Australia. Antarctic rare earths accessible to non-Chinese interests would reshape the competitive landscape of the industries that will define the 21st century economy. If fresh water from Antarctica becomes commercially accessible, the humanitarian and geopolitical implications dwarf the energy and mineral stories. The populations facing the most severe water stress in the coming decades are concentrated in regions that have the least access to alternative sources and the least ability to pay for expensive desalination. Towing Antarctic freshwater distributed at scale could be the difference between sustainable and unsustainable population trajectories for regions numbering in the billions. And if Antarctic governance were genuinely restructured to reflect the principle that the continent belongs to all of humanity, the redistribution of wealth would be historically significant. Every previous reorganization of global resource governance shifted hundreds of billions between nations. A true democratization would shift trillions. None of these outcomes are inevitable. All of them are possible. The path runs through 2048 and through whatever political and economic pressures accumulate between now and then. The question is who will be positioned to shape that path and who will arrive to find the decisions already made. There is a reason the dominant cultural narrative about Antarctica centers on penguins and polar expeditions and the heroic age of exploration rather than on geological surveys, treaty politics, and resource economics. The story of brave explorers facing the white wilderness makes everyone feel something positive. It centers the nations that dominate Antarctic governance as the inheritors of a noble tradition of discovery and the selfless stewards of a pristine environment. That narrative serves specific interests. It crowds out the other story. When the conversation about Antarctica is framed around Scott and Amundsen and Shackleton, around emperor penguins and ozone holes and ice cores revealing ancient climate data, the $500 trillion question gets pushed to the margins. It becomes fringe rather than serious economic and geopolitical analysis. The environmental framing has been effective because it is genuinely valid. The scientists doing legitimate climate research provide continuous, credible justification for the protective framework. The environmental movement that fought for the Madrid Protocol was not wrong about what it was protecting. It was operating, arguably, without full awareness of what governance structure it reinforced. Antarctica is sometimes described as the world's last great wilderness. That framing is accurate in one sense. It is profoundly inaccurate in another. Antarctica is among the most carefully and deliberately managed places on Earth. It is managed in ways that serve the interests of the nations that establish the management framework before the broader community of nations had the political standing to challenge it. The narrative of pristine wilderness beyond human reach is, in a precise and measurable sense, a managed narrative. Here is where this story lands. The Antarctic Treaty has prevented direct military conflict over a continent where several nations had overlapping territorial claims and a demonstrated willingness to use force. That is genuinely valuable. The scientific cooperation it has enabled has produced important contributions to climate science, oceanography, and our understanding of Earth's deep history. The environmental protections it has established have preserved a continent from the industrial degradation that has affected every other large landmass human beings have reached. These achievements are real, but they exist alongside a governance structure that concentrates decision, making authority over the world's largest untapped resource reserve in the hands of a small group of wealthy nations. That structure was designed in a specific historical window, before the legal and political framework for challenging it had developed. It functions, whatever its stated intentions, to advantage the nations that were positioned in 1959 and have built on that advantage every year since. And it operates under a moratorium that expires in less than 25 years. After which the conversation will change in ways that the nations currently investing in Antarctic presence have been preparing for, and the nations without that presence have not. What's under the ice would change everything. The oil, the minerals, the rare earths, the fresh water, all of it. The question that gets asked too rarely and answered too vaguely is, change everything for whom? The answer to that question is not determined by geology alone. It is determined by governance. And governance is determined by who was at the table when the rules were written, who is building infrastructure right now, and who will have legal standing and physical presence when the conversation changes in 2048. The governance structure that will shape who benefits from Antarctica's resources is not waiting for 2048 to be contested. It is being contested right now, station by station, survey by survey, diplomatic relationship by diplomatic relationship, by the nations that understand exactly what they are competing for. If this kind of economic history interests you, the kind that doesn't make it into standard curricula, subscribe now. There are so many more stories like this.